Okay, in this lesson, we are going to look at the ways in which people experience and engage with places. So, engaging with places is the title of today's lesson. So, people experience and engage places quite differently, and in general, that engagement is a lot less in urban areas than in rural areas. So there's several factors that determine how engaged people actually become with with the place in which they live. Now, what's really important is that you have in the community you have some key people willing to stand for elections, raise money, or just organize activities. Then also, when lots of activities take place, and obviously it becomes a little bit easier for people to engage as well. Then if you have local politicians keeping residents informed, provide support, involved in local activities, again, that strengthens that engagement too. Um, Also, if people are very engaged politically, um, both locally and nationally, that also strengthens that engagement in the local community too. Now, there's some other factors that actually determine the level of community engagement, and factors such as age, gender, ethnicity, length of residency, and levels of deprivation are also important. I'll come back to that later. So, we're going to look at an example exploring these points, and the example we're going to use for engagement is this village, the village of Grampound in Cornwall. So there's a map of Cornwall here. Obviously, we are familiar with Newquay here, and Grampound is here, sort of in mid Cornwall. Now, Grampound is a village of around 800 people in mid Cornwall, as I said. About 25% of the village is aged over 65, and about a third consists of single people. As we know, Cornwall is not one of the wealthiest counties. Mean weekly incomes are some of the lowest in the UK, and also things like social isolation, high travel costs are really big issues. Nevertheless, Grampound is a really thriving community. It's a village that's not known as a sort of tourist village with lots of people having second homes, but is actually known as a working village. Um, as I said, high levels of engagement. The local councillor lives in the village. He organises a local produce market each month. There's a newsletter. Um, there are lots of activities. There's a carnival. Organisations are active in the village. So really, lots of things are happening. And a good example of that community engagement was the creation of a community shop several years back, owned and run by the village. As you can see, the grand opening of the community shop here, with lots of people there in the rain. Now, the village had managed to raise £50,000 towards the village shop, and quite a substantial amount of that, about 40%, was actually raised from the villagers themselves. Um, About 90% of all households became shareholders in the new shop, um, so that they had a direct sort of interest in the success of the shop as well. The remaining funds were sort of raised from trusts and charities and a local renewable energy company. Uh, so Grandparents residents are really engaged politically as well. So turnout of local elections is a good indicator for that. It's consistently is above the national or county average, as you can read at the bottom. So political engagement is a really good indicator for that is elections actually. So generally, if we look at elections, sort of UK-wide elections have much higher turnouts than local elections, but it also varies geographically as well. So Rural areas tend to have higher turnouts than urban areas, and the choropleth map that's on the slide shows that quite clearly. So the darker areas have the higher turnouts, and the lighter areas the lower turnouts. And obviously you can see sort of areas of low turnouts, say the lighter areas around here, obviously Sheffield, Sheffield, Leeds, Bradford around here, Newcastle is around there, Sunderland, Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham, London. You can just sort of spot the sort of cities around. Um, um, and then sort of the rural areas of Scotland is very high, but other areas as well. It's just generally sort of the rural areas have high turnouts compared to the urban areas. Um, Now, political engagement also reduces as people become more removed from the center of power. Um, so this could then lead to what's known as voter apathy. So there's a lack of caring or interest of voters in an election. So elections that are, about things that people are not really care about or don't have really an interest in tend to see very low turnouts. But then, if you on the flip side of that, if you have particular issues, you might see a very high turnout. So, a good example is the devolution in Scotland in September 2014 was the Scottish independence referendum, and it had a massive turnout of 84.6%, which is really high for elections. Um, Sort of quite similarly, the EU referendum in 2016 also showed a very high level of voter engagement. Turnout was 72.2%, which is for EU elections incredibly high. Obviously, this was slightly different because it was a referendum and not a EU election by itself. But still, EU elections never managed to get a higher turnout than a turnout over 38.5%. So it's quite a difference. Looking at general elections, in general, UK general elections have higher turnouts than local elections. And it has been going up and down a little bit. I mean, the graph here at the bottom shows quite clearly how the turnout has sort of been quite high in the 1950s, slowly reduced, but is now increasing a little bit again. So the last elections was in 2017. Correction, it was actually an election in 2019. And I can actually update this. I'll have a look for when we have our lesson what the voter turnout was in 2019. But in 2017 it was 68.7%, so that was slightly up from 2015. Why does engagement vary? Going back to Grandpound, it really works as a community. Residents engage in its activity, and there's a few factors that actually contributing, helping. Age is a really important factor. So 25% of people in Grandpound are aged 65 and over, and they tend to have more time to devote to community activities. Most people over 65 have ceased to work, maybe do some voluntary work or part-time work, but they have more time on their hands. People over 60 are also more likely to vote. They're more sort of politically engaged. Gender is another key factor. More women engage in community work than men in general. That could also be because women are more likely to stay home to look after children. That could be a key factor. But for example, in Grandpound again, women were in the majority in many of the working groups and committees. Ethnicity is also a key factor. Non-white British people might differ in their views. There might be local antipathy or acceptance of people that are not British. Similarly, length of residence might be a key factor. You can imagine that new migrants and students who come and live in an area, they have less of a strong attachment to long-standing locals. And finally, deprivation is also a key factor. So high levels may be associated with anti-establishment views. Also, those in temporary accommodation or rented housing may feel less at home than people that are owning their own houses. Let's have a look at regeneration and engagement. So whenever regeneration happens, it brings change to communities, and that can cause conflict. Now, these conflicts occur especially when the process of regeneration is top-down. That is a really key point. And that top-down doesn't mean it has to come from national government. It can actually be from local government as well, local planners, developers, but anything that's imposed upon communities from above is sort of considered as top-down. Quite often that leads to conflict. Also, if you think about it, most schemes of regeneration have economic motives, while lots of communities might look at regeneration and see much more sort of social reasons why regeneration makes sense. But there's a conflict there. Also, a key factor is if you ask different people what regeneration is all about, you will get different answers. So people disagree what regeneration is all about and who it is actually for, who's going to benefit from it. So as you can sort of hear, there's sort of like issues of inequality, concerning regeneration, and it quite often can lead to resentment. Quite often local people feel that they are pushed out. Those that are benefiting from regeneration are people on higher incomes or people from elsewhere. This happens in like university towns and cities, where you can see a lot of property regeneration attracting those new residents. So there could be students that results in what we call studentification. Or different socioeconomic groups. Lifestyles are different from those of the long-term residents, and that sort of generates conflicts. And I think a very good example of this is where we've seen this happening is Stratford in London, where clearly regeneration, if you ask a lot of local people, they will say, well, it's regeneration hasn't really benefited us. Let's go back to Cornwall. Give some examples of regeneration schemes there. And again, sort of support for these regeneration schemes varies very much depending on whether they are local, regional, or supporting national policies. So for example, at a local scale, local level, Grampound Parish Council, they put a proposal forward to build 69 new houses in the village. And the community was able to share views, public meetings were held to gauge support, so residents really had a say in it as well, and they were sort of informed. So a third of the houses were classed as affordable, and actually residents were very positive because it meant more people helping to maintain the services in the village. Now, at a regional level, there was another regeneration scheme or regeneration scheme in a way. Cornwall County Council decided to build a waste incinerator with the idea that would support economic development. But there were lots of local protests, and actually only 7 local jobs were created. And as you can see on the picture, this massive high chimney is now considered as an eyesore, and people are worried about the toxic emissions as well. Nationally, Cornwall Council supported the national policy to expand renewable energy. So there's been an increase in wind turbines in the county, and a lot of people are unhappy with these wind turbines because they feel it spoils the countryside. So it quite often causes protests. So finally, I've got some questions here for you to look at, and obviously work through these, and we will discuss that during the lesson.